Today we have Eric Broda on our latest episode of What's New in Data. Eric, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic, John. How are you?
Doing great. And it's so great to have you on this episode. Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. I'll try and be relatively brief, but 30 years in the industry, almost all of it in financial services, and relevant to today's discussion, I have recently implemented a full data mesh at a global financial firm. Related to that, I've also in the past implemented numerous API and event management platforms, again, almost all at banks or large payment firms. And on top of that, and I think probably the way we got introduced here is I've written about my experiences. We can provide a link perhaps later. But really, why I'm doing this and why I've written about these things is I think Zamek has these outstanding, really revolutionary principles. But my objective really is to turn those principles into practice. And to that end, obviously, as I said, I've written some articles, but I've also started a boutique consulting firm that, to be real trite and simple, helps financial services firms accelerate their data mesh journey. Now, that being said, I don't want to necessarily pigeonhole myself just in financial services. Data mesh clearly applies across the board, but that is kind of where I understand the business needs, and I know how to marry those to some of the capabilities that the data mesh offers. So that's a little bit about myself and kind of where I'm coming from.
Excellent. Yeah. And just like you mentioned, you had this great articles, actually a series of articles that really started a lot of great dialogue and discussion around data mesh. And many people chimed in and commented on how it was probably, one of the most practical, technical, architectural views of the data mesh. We had Bruno Aziza chime in on LinkedIn as well when he reshared your post. Bruno Aziza, the head of analytics at Google Cloud. So we really appreciate that and especially appreciate you taking the time today. But, in your words, can you please define a data mesh for the listeners?
Sure. I'll kind of say what I think most people think it is at first. And that every time I hear about the discussion, it's either one of two things. One is a set of principles or a set of vague technology components. And I like to kind of describe it not only in those two ways, but I think more along the lines of what it does for enterprises. And the key thing for me, and again, I come from financial services, but I think this is pretty common across the board, is everybody's trying to move, to this so-called real-time enterprise. And what that means is, real-time data available anywhere at point of need. And in particular, I know a lot of the folks in data mesh has been around the analytics space, bringing real-time data into the analytics space. So moving away from your batch, 24-hour to 48-hour-old stale data, as I would call it, into something that enables real-time AI, machine learning, real-time decision-making. So when I think of data mesh, at one level, it's a way to enable the real-time enterprise. From a capability perspective, it lets us move data safely, reliably, and in a near real-time fashion across the enterprise. Now, the context for this, obviously, is there are several principles. Again, I'll give Zamek credit. She has, in my opinion, anyway, my humble opinion, revolutionized the way we want to look at data. But she's introduced some, capabilities or principles rather around data sovereignty. So the whole notion of federated ownership, data products, being able to put a boundary around data and establish published interactive mechanisms, formal ways to actually get at the data and participate in the data. It introduces self-serve capabilities. So it talks about, I think Zamek calls them, for the most part, interfaces, but I think she also mentions a few times as APIs, but I think it's even more than that. It's being able to subscribe to when data actually changes in the enterprise, be able to act on that. And obviously, a lot of this stuff comes together with the federated governance, principles. And I've written a recent article about that, but I think it comes to life when you combine those principles into something I call platform thinking, which is really bringing the things that Uber brings, for example, or Airbnb, the classic I think in 2016, there's an HBR article that talked about moving from pipelines to platforms. Famous article, but what they ultimately said is there's capabilities or infrastructure that allowed producers, in our case, people who produce data, and consumers, people who consume data, to bring them together and allow them to interact and, if necessary, transact in a safe, reliable way. And it provides, that platform provides the rules for all of this to actually work. That is what, to me, the federated governance mechanism actually is. Now, the last component, my apologies for a very long answer, which should be a very simple answer to a good question, is the last piece of the puzzle is coming back to, where a lot of folks are starting to move to, is how do I make these principles real as well through some technology components. So there's a bunch of them that I write in my articles. There's probably a few more as the topic area becomes more mature, but minimally there's an event backbone that allows us to move data or data captured as events across various different data products. There's change data capture that allows us to understand when data changes in a data product. There's APIs to allow us to provide a formal mechanism, if you will, to access and reach into the data product to get data. There's immutable, what I call immutable logs, which allow us to capture not just the changes and not just the event sourcing database, but rather being able to aggregate those into data lineage events. So being able to understand what happened to your data, when it happened, who did it, and that type of stuff. And the last component is the ability to provide catalogs, data product catalogs, that allow consumers and producers to discover, view, and simply consume data. So for a very simple question, a very long-winded answer, but that's how there's different dimensions of the answer, but that's how I look at a data mesh.
Excellent. Yeah, and I know you referred to some of the points you talked about in your article on data mesh patterns, but would you be able to, take a step back and walk us through, how that article came to be, what inspired you to write it? Was it from a customer use case or just a fusion of seeing what different organizations were doing? Would love to hear about that as well.
Sure. A lot of it, as I mentioned, kind of one of the things I try and do is in a selfish perspective, I suppose it helps me build my consulting company. But being able to write about these things and offer, I hope, and perhaps maybe I am offering a unique perspective, allows the industry, if you will, data mesh in particular, to progress. Now, the reason I'm writing about these is because I think there's some very common problems that people need to solve, and a lot of it has to do with being able to move data safely, reliably, in a faster way across the enterprise. So if I think about the situation that catalyzed this, we started this data mesh thing at my client probably about 2 years ago, before right around the time, I think, when Zamak published her article. In retrospect, we didn't have access to it, but we had this kind of mini crisis, which obviously I'm not going to get into, but there's this mini crisis that forced us to look differently at how we manage our data. And one core aspect of that was how do we move data not in a batch 24-hour stale way, but how do we move it in a much more real-time way? And that moved us into first an API platform, then an event management platform, and then a change data capture platform that allows us to actually address the specific business need, which is I needed to move data across the enterprise in a real-time, not batch fashion. And when we did this, I was talking to my client just the other day. When we did this, we realized that while we didn't call it the data mesh, we used the data fabric word, but we actually built the data mesh. And then we realized very quickly that we're not the only ones to have this problem. And in fact, data mesh solves a number, that's just one example that I mentioned there, but it solves a number of problems. And what I found is as we explain data mesh, not just in terms of the principles, not just in terms of the technology, but what it can actually do or enable, that's when my clients, which typically are senior executives at banks and insurance companies and payment providers, that's when the light bulb goes on, and that's where I think you start to see some real change in enterprises, and that's the thing that really gets me going.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the points you mentioned there, such as change data capture, which is essentially a way of capturing changes from operational systems in real time and propagating them to downstream consumers. That's not a new technology, right? It's been around for a while. I mean, it is being modernized. Just to plug Stream, our company, we do offer change data capture as a cloud native service on a streaming engine. Um, but it is being applied in new ways. So, what do you think are kind of the new challenges that we're seeing?
As it relates to CDC in particular, or
Yeah.
yeah, so I think there's a few things around CDC. First off, I think it's been around for a long time, and I think the founder of Stream actually was one of the first folks to actually make it real. But I think CDC is an not as well understood and definitely underused capability. And if you think about it, again, I'll characterize it in terms of what you can do with CDC. So I've been involved quite heavily in a number of AI machine learning initiatives. And one of the things that time and time again is required is I need to be able to demonstrate for any model that has materiality described, at least in financial services, that means that it impacts, your ability to offer financial services to somebody, or something that materially impacts the risk posture of a bank. That if you want to have models that do that, and you need that before you can push them, so to speak, into production, you need to have reproducibility, traceability, and verifiability. So now the question really is, how do you demonstrate that? Well, that's where data lineage comes in. It is all about data lineage. So coming back to now to answer your question, why CDC? Well, change data capture provides the core information that when you aggregate it and look at it a little bit differently, it actually provides all the information you need for data lineage. So CDC has when something changes, it provides the metadata about that change. So who did it, when did it happen, what was the before after, what was the after, the before image rather, and the after image. Now, if you think about that, data lineage is just the sum of all the changes that occur to data. Now, the interesting thing about the data mesh is if I can actually capture those events, and I do, that's what CDC does. But if I can actually aggregate those events and track them based off the data element, and then trace the event stream that actually caused those things to change, all of a sudden I get data lineage. So why CDC? Well, at the lowest technical level, it offers the ability to understand, to capture when data changes in near real time. The more practical thing is once you apply it to things like data lineage, all of a sudden what you do is you open up tremendous business opportunities to solve really, really practical problems. So CDC, in my mind, is one of the fundamental cornerstones of a data mesh architecture.
Yeah, and it just seems like as enterprises are accumulating more and more data in their data lakes and their data warehouses, traceability is so critical. How does data lineage practically come into play there?
Yeah, so reproducibility and traceability is all about saying, so for example, if I have an AI machine learning model, the regulators, at least in financial services, will say, yeah, at any point in time, they, and trivializing this, there's more complexity of this, but they can come in and say, for that particular model, reproduce the result. Okay, based off of it. So what they do is you get the model, you run it with the data that you have there. Then they say demonstrate traceability so that you can actually confirm that, through all the machinations and re-engineering of data, that the data from the source was not materially or incorrectly altered as it was engineered in the process. That's the traceability. So if you want to actually provide and address that fundamental regulatory requirement, you need to have data lineage. You need to understand, what the source data was, when it changed, how it changed, who it changed, how it was re-engineered across the full, what I would characterize as the event stream. and be able to convey that to a regulator and prove that you understand your data and what happened to it along the way. That's the fundamental capability you need to answer a very simple question from the regulators, which is your model emitting the right outcome, and can you prove it?
Yeah, that sounds pretty mission critical, especially in a regulated environment. And one of the things that we see as well is, at a high level, enterprises are operationalizing their data more and more. They're building enterprise reports, but they're also sending customers offers. They're detecting fraud. They're doing a lot of really business critical use cases. And at the end of the day, being able to trust that data and know that it's accurate and correct is so critical now, to really to organizations' bottom lines, especially when they're putting all the data together and actually using it in these business applications.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I would agree 100%.
So, let's say I'm a data practitioner or a data engineer, and I'm sold on a data mesh pattern. And from a technical perspective, where do I start?
Sure, that's actually a very good question. So here's the typical approach that I focus on. So obviously, there's a discussion to be had around what is the problem I'm trying to solve, and to be honest with you, that sounds like a simple thing. It actually is not. It requires engaging, the business audience and understanding to some level intimately what their business does and which particular problems you're trying to solve. That being said, let's assume that a business executive said, I need to solve the problem, this particular problem. It's well understood, and we think this data mesh concept applies. What do I do next? Well, there's really kind of three streams that you need to think about. There's clearly a technology stream. There's some foundational components. We talked about CDC or immutable log or the event streaming backbone, whatever the case may be. Those components need to be implemented. So that's the most obvious stream. However, what we found is that the overlooked stream, or perhaps underestimated in terms of importance stream, is this whole notion around platform thinking, ownership, and governance. So that really says, how do I, it's conceivably quite simple to say, this is a data product. We'll put a broad owner, bucket around, a boundary around it, and Joe or Sally, you're the owner. That actually doesn't have much use unless the owner is empowered with decision-making rights and funding rights, and they have the accountability for creating the roadmap, if you will, for the platform. The owner needs to identify who their consumers are. The owner needs to identify who their producers are. The owner needs to identify what is the mechanism by which I'm going to govern this data and make it visible and discoverable. So that whole thing relates to platform thinking, the Uber model, if you will, and the Airbnb model of producers, consumers, and platforms, and bringing that inside the enterprise, and then starting to apply Zamex principles. So now that I have the ability to talk about consumers, producers, platforms, what do I want to do with them? I want to actually create a data product. Okay. And that data product will now have an owner, and the owner actually is responsible for that platform. The owner is responsible for engaging producers and consumers. The owner is responsible for providing the rules to that platform. The owner now is responsible for identifying and funding the APIs or the event capability that provides the ability to access that, and then that naturally flows to governance. So that's stream number two. The arguably the most important stream is what I call it the making it real stream. And that's about every time that you deploy technology, you can do it one of two ways. One is you can do a 12-month deployment, and then big bang, something magical happens and the world's problems are solved. That tends not to work. What I find is a much more rigorous approach that combines elements of agile, but really is simply stated. It's I want to make it real by implementing a POC. So what are the risks that I need to address? Okay, let's make sure we got those figured out. If that means I have to implement certain technology components, great. If I need to test the theory on the platform thinking, great. So the first step is address my risks, okay? And that, could be anywhere from 1 week to 1 month to 3 months. But if you're doing it longer than that, you're probably, going well beyond a POC. Next step, MVP. Usually, 1 to 3 MVPs is what I do with my clients. Minimum viable product, obviously. But what the difference between a POC and an MVP is, an MVP goes into production and you get real learnings around operability, observability. You have to solve your security challenges right there. And then, so it forces you to think about the industrialization of the data mesh. But now that I've got it industrialized, what do I do next? Well, I want to rinse and repeat, right? If I've done it for 3 data products, 3 data product MVPs, maybe I want to do it for the 20, 50, 60, 100 other that are out in the enterprise. So I want to set up a repeatable factory. And the factory is all about how do I actually spin up platforms, which, embody data products and identify the ownerships and the governance model, and do that really, really quickly in parallel across multiple different geographies. So now that I've built the factory, last stage obviously is rollout. So those are the kind of the 3 streams. But if you think about, to answer your question very directly, what do I do first? The very first step is I need to have some semblance of a strategy that addresses those things. So normally when I do this work, I usually have everything I try and do is in 3 months chunks. So a strategy, max, by the way. A strategy is max 3 months. Then we go to POC, which usually is less than 3 months. Then we try and do 1 to 3 MVPs in production in 3 months. And in parallel, we build a factory and do the rollout in 3 months. And by the time 12 months have elapsed, you have a production data mesh with 3 to N number of data products in production. I've done that. It actually works, but it starts with that strategy. The strategy has to say first off, for those who are not aware of what data mesh actually is, so it's a little bit of data mesh 101 education. So talk a little bit about the principles, but more importantly, again, what can I do with the data mesh? That outcome then, that creates a set of outcomes, which is typically addressed in a vision document, if you will, but that talks about the target state from a business perspective and the target state from an architecture perspective. And then obviously, there's a little bit of analysis around what we have and what we need, but ultimately it culminates in a roadmap that says, here's how I'm going to get to my destination, which ultimately is production and many data products along the way. So that's, at a macro level. And then, what do I do tomorrow? That's what I would normally do, in terms of a strategy and then a broader rollout plan.
That was a very comprehensive answer. And I think that now anybody who wants to build a data mesh within an enterprise is really equipped to do it. And you covered a bit about this, but how would you champion the business value of a data mesh? What would you say is like the main business metric that a data mesh team can provide to their stakeholders?
Yeah, I think there's probably several ways of championing this. The most successful is by linking yourself to business outcomes. The least successful is to look at it as plumbing. And if you look at it as plumbing, first off, the journey, no matter which way you slice and dice, it is in the millions of dollars by the time you get stuff into production. And any amount of money in lieu of a business case, or at least an articulation of business value, is just a high number. So I rarely start with data mesh as a technology, but rather I talk about data mesh as a way to solve practical business problems. So I'll be, a little spoiler alert, I'll be putting out articles on this in the next 3 months. I'll probably be partnering with a large tech provider on some of these. But here's an example of 4 or 5 outcomes that they're not. Now I mentioned them because they're not. I did a little bit of thinking to figure out what's unique to financial services and try not to talk about those, but what is common? What are common business problems with a very strong technology slant that almost every industry has? So let me kind of walk through a few. First one is, by the way, data mesh, I'll explain how data mesh enables each of these. So the first one, what do I find, and this is very prevalent in insurers, in banks, but applies to other industries also, clearly government, health providers, et cetera, but mainframe modernization, or legacy modernization. Even Oracle these days may be considered legacy, depending on your perspective. So the question is, if I got this legacy, how do I move it to the cloud? Well, data mesh allows you to do that. That combination of CDC, capturing the information as it changes, putting it on Kafka, moving it across and putting it into a MongoDB on the cloud, and be able to do that in a repeatable fashion to the point where you have live replicas. And now they have live replicas. I may be able to actually move the reads from the legacy and put it onto the new MongoDB version. And once that's stable, maybe I can start to turn the writes off of the legacy and put it onto the new. So now what I've done is I've used, like, from an architecture perspective, which is kind of my background from back in the day, I've used like the live replica pattern, a CQRS pattern, a strangler fig pattern. But ultimately what I've done is I've been able to move data, the data gravity well, from the legacy environment into the cloud. And as I've done that, I've been able to turn elements of the legacy off. So that's a big problem for any organization that is thinking about moving off the mainframe and some of the pretty expensive licensing costs. And the second scenario related to that is a lot of organizations that I see is when you talk about using the cloud, the typical response that I see is yeah, we're using the cloud a lot. We're using Salesforce, for example, or we're using provider X, Y, or Z. But the question really is, so in your own cloud instance, what are you actually doing? And the answer typically is underwhelming. And the reason for that is it's very practical. This is not a disparaging comment to anybody, but the practicality is the data gravity well. All the apps are around the data. The data gravity well is in the data center. So the question really is, how do I move the data gravity well from the data center onto the cloud? And then by doing that, moving the data gravity well, the applications start to follow. Well, lo and behold, similar to the mainframe modernization, really, I just talk about apps or data in general in the data center, and data mesh allows me to move that over onto the cloud. So all of a sudden now what happens is I can dramatically accelerate my cloud adoption. That's the second one. There's things like, can I address the master data management problem? There's definitely ways to do that differently than in the traditional fashion, which is I move all my master data into an all singing intergalactic database and expect that to be the book of record for critical information in the organization. There's different ways to do that with data mesh. Same thing around, we talked about earlier, AI, machine learning enablement. How do I engender reproducibility, traceability, verifiability? Well, data mesh, and in particular CDC, in combination with the immutable log and the data lineage capability, addresses that. So really championing this is about talking in the language of the business, and being able to explain, in business terms, how am I going to solve this particular problem, but fully recognizing that technology is a key enabler to this. And that's where the seeds of championing data mesh actually start.
Yeah, and that's such an excellent, unique perspective that we appreciate, that you've been able to kind of make the data mesh something that's practical and approachable for many data teams. And we definitely look forward to the new articles that you come out with over the next few months. Eric, it was great having you on this episode of What's New in Data. Thank you again for your time.
Hey, John, thank you very much for having me. Great being here.
Thank you.